How democratic is the European Union really? That's actually quite a difficult question to answer, but let's take as our starting point democracy in the UK. Now, democracy in the UK is in many ways an unusual sort of beast. It's simple to the point of being rather brutal. When we think of democracy in the UK, we typically think of the voters go to the polls, they choose a one-party majority, that one-party majority governs for probably 5 years, has lots of power, and if the voters don't like it, they can chuck them out after 5 years and elect Her Majesty's opposition to take over the reins of government. Now, as we know, this isn't always what happens. It didn't happen in 2010 when we elected a coalition after several days of negotiation, and it hasn't happened in 2017 when it's still not absolutely clear what the government's majority is going to consist of. But still, it has happened after most elections in the UK in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a simple process, it looks very clear, and it is also very brutal, and that brutality actually makes it rather less democratic. After all, most single-party majority governments elected since 1997 have been elected only by about 25%, yes, 25% of the total UK electorate. How democratic do you think that is? Other democracies have other recipes which in some ways are less simple but rather more democratic. The United States has the checks and balances between the President and Congress, which meant that Barack Obama could not do exactly as he wished because he had a mostly Republican Congress. Some of us regretted that. Equally, Donald Trump cannot do exactly as he wished because of the moderate Republicans and the Democrats in his Congress, and some of us are very, very happy about that indeed. Turning to the Federal Republic of Germany, we have a proportional representation system which very regularly produces coalition governments which are among the most stable governments in Europe today. The Germans also are accustomed, being a federal state, to share quite a lot of central government power with the constituent lender of the Federal Republic. So when you say how democratic, well, different states have different sorts of democracy, and some prioritise brutal effectiveness, like ours of the first past the post. Others have rather more priority towards representativeness. Where does the EU stand on this? Well, first of all, it very clearly has some of the features that you would expect to find in a democratic state. It's got a directly elected parliament. That directly elected parliament is in some ways freer, less disciplined than the heavily whipped majority of the House of Commons, for example. And it's got real teeth. It's impossible to imagine, for example, the President of the European Commission, a figure nominated by the democratically elected governments of the member states, being sworn into office without the agreement of the democratically elected Parliament of the European Union. The Parliament of the European Union ratifies the choice of the member states, not just of the President, but of the Commission as a whole. The Parliament of the European Union can, through a vote of censure, overthrow the Commission. Indeed, the collective resignation of the Santer Commission in 1999 happened because they resigned before being pushed. So yes, the directly elected European Parliament does have real teeth, and the Commission, often identified as the least democratic part of the European Union, is itself nominated by the democratically elected member states and ratified by the Parliament. Moreover, of course, the Commission's proposals do not simply go straight through without any discussion. They have to be agreed by the Council of Ministers, representing the governments of the member states, as well as by the European Parliament. Now, it is true that the Commission does pass a certain number of regulations to do with implementing certain policies, such as the Common Agricultural Policy, from day to day, from week to week, which don't go through the full democratic process. Things like, well, this is going to be the price of wheat this week, for example, or the price of any other agricultural produce. But these are regulations which, in a conventional member state, would not be debated by Parliament anyway. That's why there's this ambiguity between the Brexiters, who say that something like 65% of our laws are made by the European Union, possibly true if you include the tiniest of regulations which are in one day and out the other, but certainly not true if you limit it to the kinds of legislation which would normally be debated within the House of Commons. In that case, the figure is much nearer to sort of about 12.5% or so of UK legislation, real laws, that have their origin in directives from the European Union. One final point about democracy in the European Union is that, in some ways, perhaps the European Union shouldn't be expected to be quite as democratic as a state. It is not a state. It's never going to be a state. Consider this. What proportion of total GDP of a typical member state is spent by government and the public sector generally? How much do you think? Well, the answer is between about 40%, maybe the upper 30s, to about 55% in countries like Scandinavia. So Britain at the end of the Thatcher era, it was about 37% spent by government at central and local level. In the Scandinavian countries with their big expensive welfare states, it's in the low 50s, as indeed it is in France. What are the big items of expenditure there? We're looking at pensions, welfare, health, education, defence, transport. All of those things remain very much under the control of national governments. Now consider how much of the total GDP of the EU is spent by the European Union. The answer is about 1%. To put it in another way, the European Union in 2015 spent a total for all the EU 28 countries of about £125 billion. The UK government in 2016 spent, just for the UK, about £800 billion. So, in terms of the big spending figures, really the EU isn't like a state at all. It looks more like an international organisation, and it's a damn sight more democratic than any international organisation I know. Does NATO, for example, have a directly elected parliament? I don't think it does. In the end, what matters about the EU is not how much it spends, because if we stopped contributing to the budget of the EU, we would hardly notice it as a nation, but rather it's the benefit it brings to its member states and will continue to bring. After all, the EU has brought to its member states a period of sustained peace and prosperity unparalleled since the days of the Antonine emperors. And that's not me saying it, it's Boris Johnson in his biography of Winston Churchill before he turned into a Brexiter. Thank you very much.